What a beautiful, beautiful morning the Lord has blessed us with. It is so good to be back here with you. And I'll tell you, I'm excited to go and be at Tahoe next week, as I do every summer for the last 18 years. But I'm getting to where I just miss being home. So pray for me this last time next week, as I'll be out there in California for the Tahoe encampment. And then I'm home for months and months. So I'm excited to be back. So pray for me with that. And I appreciate so much Tom being able to fill in these times. Also, we just in case anybody's not super busy late on Tuesday afternoon, we're signing papers and starting to move things in rapidly before I have to leave at 5 in the morning on Wednesday morning. So maybe my wife can sleep in our new home while I'm gone. So if anybody wants to help, we won't turn you away, I promise. So just ask me about that. This morning we're going to talk about the word balance. Balance. You know what that means, right? That's when something doesn't tilt one way or the other. When it finds the median, the center. And doesn't seem like a very likely topic as we study the scriptures, because it's not really a very likely topic in our world in any realm of life. I mean, there's just not a lot of balance in this world. There's not a lot of balance when it comes to faith and religion. Typically, people are extremists, right? They go to the great, I guess you might say, polar opposites and tend to land there. And then you have politically, there's not a whole lot of balance. There's extremism on both ends of the spectrum. And that's true in people's personalities. People are extremists. In almost every area of life, you don't see very much balance. You know why? Balance is difficult. Have you ever noticed that? You try to balance something right on its center. If you just get it just a hair too far to one side or the other, what happens? It tilts. Because balance is difficult to find. And frankly, you can't be lazy and find it. It takes effort. It takes conscious desire and work to find balance. But I think that, like no other time in history, Christianity needs to be focused on the truth of how important balance is in our faith. Because of the images of Christianity that are being put out there for the world to see. Think about some of the things that people witness and what they would think of when it comes to Christianity. Westboro Baptist Church. You know what I'm talking about? Those folks who protest at military funerals and say the most awful, horrible things and have signs. That's what a lot of people in our world think of when they think of Christianity. Is it any wonder that there are those who think that Christians are worse than Islam in regard to their attitude towards people they disagree with when they see on the news that being promoted? What about some of the other examples of extremism that people see? You see televangelists. And this is the idea some people have about Christianity. Someone who wants to sell you something that doesn't have anything tangible to it. In other words, they're selling you some kind of just health and wealth gospel. If you'll send in your donation of $50, then we'll send you this free gift of a prayer cloth that I have prayed over. And if you pray over this prayer cloth and wipe it on your forehead 8 times a day, then you will be blessed monetarily for this. And people are not stupid. They can see through that. Amen. Can't they? And so they say, Christianity? Because they see that extremism. What about those who claim to be Christians? We have politicians who, when asked, what's your faith? They'll say, well, I'm Christian. And what that means, I go to church once a year. Because it's politically convenient. When I preached in Alabama, I was surprised because I was driving around town one day and I saw a big billboard for a politician. And this politician noted on the billboard in huge block letters that they were a member of the congregation where I preached. And I had never met this person, state senator. I'd never met this person. So I asked one of the elders, I said, is so-and-so a member here? Oh yeah, during election seasons. You'll start to see that person real soon. Sure enough, for about the next 6 months, every service. Now I'm not trying to judge anybody's heart. I'm saying though, that's not terribly uncommon, is it, in our world? Every one of those instances are unfortunately a stain upon the image of Jesus Christ and His church. And it's because of extremism. It's because, frankly, extremism is what sells, is what is interesting, what engenders attention. But it's the quiet, powerful influence of balance which would best describe who Jesus was and who He's called His people to be. How often do we see the Christian life presented as a healthy, happy, and balanced lifestyle? How often do you see that in our world? Where Christianity is presented as a healthy, happy, and balanced lifestyle. You don't see that very often. And you might say, well, that's because the world controls the media and the world control. And there's some truth to that. There's some truth. I mean, the enemy has his hand in this. There's no doubt. But there's also some truth to this. Because some Christians don't live a healthy, balanced lifestyle. Because they haven't found the importance of putting forth the effort to find that balance point in every aspect of life. You see, regardless of what the propaganda might say, Jesus lived a life that was full and was balanced. And in some ways, that's the most radical kind of life. You realize that? It's an irony, but the most radical type of life in a world of radical lives is the life that isn't radical. Isn't that odd? It's the life that finds balance when everybody else gravitates to the extremes. And it's even evidenced in Scripture clearly that Jesus lived this full and balanced life and has called us to do the same. Look at our primary text this morning. Luke chapter 2 and verse 52. Luke 2:52. This is a very short verse talking about Christ as He was maturing into a man in His youth. But it gives us some profound insight into who He was. It says, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and in favor with man. Now you understand that the fact that He increased, that He matured, that He grew in all of those areas is significant. And we're going to talk about that. But the fact that every single one of those four areas, which are the four cornerstones, foundations of living, of life itself, the fact that He increased in equal measure in all four of those areas tells us that Jesus absolutely, unequivocally lived a balanced life. Because you hear people who aren't balanced, they don't care about 1, 2, 3 of those areas. I've heard Christians say, well, I don't care what men think about me. All I care about what the Lord thinks. Was that Jesus? He lived in wisdom, He grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and what? Man. With man. Should we care what men think if we want to be like Jesus? There are those who just live their lives thinking about the image they put forth to other people, and they don't think about what God would want. Well, that wouldn't be like Jesus. There are those who have no care for their stature, for their physical body. And they focus, that life is not about the material. Life is just about the spiritual. Yeah, that's an extreme. It's not balanced. Jesus cared about the physical because He grew in stature. Oh, well, a person doesn't need intellectual pursuits. A person doesn't need to study. All I need to do is just pray and get close to God. And all of those things are worldly. Jesus grew in wisdom. You understand? All of those different foundation stones of life were balanced. He found the balance. And if we're to be people who are modeling our lives like unto Him in a world of extremism, we're to be a people who search, who put forth the effort, because it's harder, folks. It's harder to find that balance than it is just to fall to one extreme or the other. Because all you need to do to fall to one extreme or the other is gravity. It'll do all the work. But it takes constant adjustment, constant effort to find the balance in life. Jesus had a powerful impact on this world because that's the result of a truly balanced life. Let's look at a few things. First of all, he mentions 4 things: wisdom, stature, favor with God and man. We're not going to go through them in that order because I'm going to break them down from, I guess you might say, least important to most important. So let's start with this one. Jesus grew in stature. He grew in stature. He grew in balance in regard to his physical body. And he's asked us to follow in his footsteps. It tells us when we look in passages like 1 John chapter 2 that our aim as Christians is to walk in his steps, just as he walked. That means to model yourself after Jesus, to be an image of Jesus to the world. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 tells us we are ambassadors of Christ to this world. That means we are his representatives. We are his voice to this world. To model him, to be like him. So to do that, we have to grow in stature. We have to care about our physical selves. Now, I know we live in a world that's crazy about this. We live in a world that's unbalanced about this, don't we? We live in a world of extremes. We live in a world where you either eat nothing, except, kale and quinoa or whatever that's called. Or at the other end of the extreme, fast food. I mean, honestly, there's a lot of talk about health in our society, but there's not a lot of talk about balance. Correct? There's not a lot of talk about balance. I mean, you think about it. Fitness and health are valid reasons to give attention to the body, but there's a higher purpose in this as well. The body, according to our Bible, is the temple of God. The body's the temple. It is sanctified. The word sanctified means to be set apart, made special. That's what it means. And your body, and I know you may look in the mirror, on the days that you aren't all gussied up and on Sunday attire, when you're just looking at plain old you, and you might think it doesn't look like much of a temple. But the reality is it has been set apart. It has been made special. And it's not because of how it looks. It's because of who has taken up residence there, according to Scriptures. You see that text that was read for us from Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. He says, I urge you, therefore, brothers, to present your... Now, what's the word he uses? We focus a lot on the renewing of your mind part, but that's not the only part of that text. He says to present your what? Bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And then he connects it to your mind. And don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. So he talks about the mind, but before he does, he talks about the importance of presenting our bodies as living sacrifices. That means considering our bodies, living a life that's balanced in regard to our bodies. You see, divinity dwells within us. And that in and of itself is a powerful, powerful reality. 1 Corinthians chapter 6:19, or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost who is in you, whom you have from God, for you are not your own. You see, that helps us to find balance. And we will falter. We will fail. Because gravity's working against us, right? To cause us to tilt one way or the other. But You know, it helps us to find that balance when we realize everywhere I go, everything I do, everywhere and everything I subject this body to, I subject the Spirit, who is my life partner, every day to that. Because the Spirit lives in me. He's with me. And this body is important because of that reality. You see, 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8. Paul, in speaking to Timothy, says, "For bodily exercise profits a little, but godliness is profitable for all things, having promise of the life that is now is, and that which is to come." Now, I find that text to be really helpful, because he says, you know, bodily exercise profits a little. So he's not in any way trying to diminish the spiritual, the intellectual, and he says very plainly, bodily exercise is less important. You know, if you had to choose between physical bodily exercise and spiritual exercise, choose spiritual. But you often don't, do you? The beautiful thing is we live in a society where you can read your Bible on a treadmill. Isn't that beautiful? And you can read your body. I mean, read your body. You can, I don't even know what that would mean. You can read your Bible, you know, while you're enjoying a healthy meal, or the occasional not so healthy but tasty one, because that would be balance. See, we don't have to choose. So he says bodily exercise is less profitable, but he doesn't say it isn't profitable. He says here, and I think it's very intriguing the way that it's stated. He says, having promise of the life that now is and the life that which is to come. You see, heaven's the most important thing for us. That's our ultimate goal. But we need to have a good life here if we can. So he says, don't ignore your body, your physical body. Find balance. You say, it's not, this is to say that, yes, the body, it's less important than spiritual things. But Jesus even took time. Do you know that there are at least 4 recorded times in the Gospels when Jesus took time away from his spiritual ministry to rest his body? Jesus recognized the importance of growing and being balanced in stature. Secondly, we move to this one. For Jesus grew in wisdom. And that would teach us about the importance of balance in regard to intellectual wisdom type of pursuits. Intellectual pursuits tend to follow extremes. I've taught college for a couple years as an adjunct professor, and it was a blessing in my life. But I found out there are 2 kinds of students, basically. There are the A students and the D students. There's not a whole lot of B- students. There just aren't. I mean, because like everything else in life, we tend to fall with gravity on one side or the other. Intellectual pursuits tend to follow those extremes. Total focus or none at all. And the reality is that either one can be distracting from who we're supposed to be for Jesus. Christ balanced his intellect with his social life. He balanced the two. Learning should be a lifetime process as a portion of our lives, but it should never be an end unto itself. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1. Interesting text in 1 Corinthians 8:1, where Paul is once more speaking, and he says, "Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge, but knowledge puffs up, but love edifies." Here's the thing. I've seen it too often, where folks who are very focused, and we live in a society where we think, let me just burst your bubble. I'm sorry to tell you that what the media has proclaimed is not true. But the solution to all of society's ills is not education. It's not. Now, I'm a believer in education. I engaged in a lot of education in my life, and I think most of you are as well. But understand that we could have a society where everyone had a PhD and sin would still be rampant. And people would still be ugly to each other and take advantage of each other. That's the reality of this world. So we have to be balanced in this, don't we? That just because there's more education, it is not the absolute end-all solution to all problems. Now, is it important? Does it help to find solutions to problems? Yes, it does. But we need to be balanced. We need to be balanced. So that means we're people who pursue intellectual pursuits, but don't make it the ultimate aim of our life. Don't make it the ultimate aim of our life. There was a 63-year-old New York man, it was recorded in newspapers just a few years back, who passed away in New York City, and the interesting part of his life is he had never held a job. Because when he was a young man, very, very young man, a rich relative had left a trust in his name that would provide him a living as long as he went to school. Now, it was intended that it would provide him a living and for him to get through, college and maybe graduate school, and then he wouldn't need it any longer, and then the rest could be given to charity. But he found a loophole. Since it was worded that it provided him a living as long as he was a full-time student, he spent his entire life till he died at 63 as a full-time student. Now you look at that and you wonder, why? Really, I'm sure he had degree after degree. But to what end? Right? An education is to be used for a purpose. But you've missed the point if it's just about intellectual pursuits, without any balance of understanding that those intellectual pursuits have to be put to good use in the world. You see, the Bible should be our first intellectual pursuit. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't have others. But it should be the driving force. It should be the tempering reality of all other things that we care about. And we should stay informed. It would be unbalanced for us to stick our heads in the sand and not even know, not even learn, not even study, not even pay attention to things in this world. And I know sometimes Christians have thought that's the best approach. But look at 1 Chronicles. This is an interesting text. 1 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 32. It says, "And the children of Issachar, who had understanding of the times." Listen to that again. The children of Issachar, who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do. Their chiefs, who were 100, and all their brethren, were at their command. So in Israel at that time, the people that the Israelites turned to for wisdom and advice, what do we do next? How do we proceed in this world? They turned to the people who knew something about that world. This is not a group of people who had stuck their heads in the sand and ignored. No, this is a people who thought that learning had value. Learning intellectually, learning about society, they thought it had value, but it was in balance. It was for the purpose of leading God's people to good things. So we must have balance in regard to intellectual pursuits. Grow in wisdom. Thirdly, balance. It says Jesus grew in stature and in favor with God and with man. Balance in regard to our relationship with other people. Christians are to interact with the world around us without being influenced by that world. Remember Jesus said that about his disciples? He said in John chapter 17, he said, "Lord, don't take them out of the world, but keep them from the world." The very essence of being a Christian is a bottle floating in the sea. You know what a bottle, you've seen that, right? You can stick a message in the bottle and throw it out in the sea, and maybe with the right kind of luck, it'll get to somebody. Why is that? Because a bottle will forever float on the sea. And it's in the sea. But it never sinks unless the sea is in it. You understand? You see, He's called us not to be a people who take our bottle and remove it from the sea of this world. No! He says, Lord, don't take them out of the world, but keep them from the world. Folks, we live in this world. We don't need to deny that reality. We just need to keep the world from living in us. And then we can float on the surface, surrounded by the world everywhere, but never consumed by it. Look at what is said by the Apostle Paul in this regard in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. This is a very helpful text. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 9 and verse 10. He says, I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. I mean, that makes sense to us, right? Don't keep company with sexually immoral people. But in fact, I don't know that I've ever heard another lesson preached on verse 10. Because we often preach the message of verse 9. Stay away from sexually immoral people. But what does it say in verse 10? Yet, I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world. Did not mean what? I didn't mean not to keep company with them. Because you know what? We are not the Amish. And we are not the Essenes. Jesus could have been an Essene. There were 4 distinct sects of Judaism at the time of Christ. There was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We know about them. There was also the Zealots. Simon the Zealot was one of his disciples. They were kind of a political wing of Judaism. But there was also the Essenes. The Essenes separated themselves from society because they didn't want to interact with the world. They wanted to be pure and righteous and holy and not have any temptations whatsoever to be like people around them. So they separated themselves in communes and they simply transcribed the Word of God. That's why we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, is because of the Essenes. But Jesus wasn't a Pharisee. And he wasn't a Sadducee. And he wasn't a Zealot. And he wasn't an Essene. Because Christians have never been called to separate themselves from the world around them. Because we cannot win the world if we're not with them. We can't. Now don't misunderstand. I'm not preaching to love the world. The Bible's clear that if you love the world, it is enmity to God. You can't love both. But we're to be in the world, not so that they will influence us, but so that we can influence them. So he says, I wrote to you in this epistle, don't keep company with sexually immoral people, yet I certainly did not mean with the immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or with the extortioners, or with the idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. You would need to go out of the world. But now I have written you not to keep company with anyone named a brother who is a fornicator, or a covetous, or an idolater. You see what he's telling us here? Is he says, have balance. Have balance. Don't you be a fornicator or covetous or an idolater or an adulterer or any of the above. Keep yourself pure and righteous and holy. But in doing that, don't become an extremist that says, well, I can't have anything to do with anybody. Those kind of people. That's not like Jesus, folks. He ate at sinners' homes. He spent time with them, he influenced them, and he changed them. We need to have balance in regard to our relationships with others. S.H. Hall, a successful preacher from the previous century, wrote his memoirs. And in his memoirs, he recorded 2 things that he believed were the key to his success in life. He said, number 1, I determined that I would not let a soul on earth stick closer to the book than I do. Closer to the Bible than I do. And number 2, I determined that I would let no soul be kinder or more considerate, even with others who differ from me, than I am. I think that's a beautiful balance to be like Jesus, don't you? God made man to live within the context of community. But we need to be the people who float on the sea of this world without letting that world get inside of us, so that we can influence the world around us. Balance. And fourthly, in favor with God. Even with all of these considerations, it must be remembered that the believer's primary aim is to please God. Above all else, the primary aim in our life, the reason we stay in this filthy world, is because He wants us to. Because He loves them too. You understand? It's the only reason. He don't want us to have to stay in this filthy world. We're not floating in a beautiful Caribbean sea, right? We're floating in a polluted Indian Ocean with filth everywhere. God doesn't want that for us. But what He does want is us to be an influence for all those around us. And so everything we do, the balance that we strive for that's so difficult to find every day, we do it primarily above all else because we want to please Him. 2 Corinthians 5:9 is just a tremendous text where he tells us, therefore we make it our aim. That's our objective. That's our very goal. We make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well pleasing to Him. The first question we should ask in everything in life is what most pleases the Lord. What brings glory to Him? You see, the word used is He grew in wisdom and stature in favor with God. Favor means, you know what it means. Favor. When someone finds your favor, it's when you're pleased with them. When you're happy. When you say, like God did, when His Son came up out of that water as John the Baptist baptized Him, and the voice from heaven couldn't hold it back anymore, and He said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. That's favor. That's favor, and it should be our objective in all things. We can never do enough, and this has to be important. I think we missed it sometimes. Obedience, folks, we do not obey the Lord so that He will love us and forgive us. We obey the Lord because He's loved us and forgiven us. Because you can't ever obey Him enough to deserve that. Right? But the fact that He has should be a powerful motivator to try our very best to bring about His good favor. We look at texts like James chapter 2 and verse 10. James 2 verse 10, where James will write, for whoever shall keep the whole law yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. And that illustrates for us powerfully that we don't do this in any way to earn. We don't obey so that, and we've preached it wrong sometimes. I've used this with my children. You know, how can you expect to be a Christian? How do you expect God to be pleased with you? But I'll go beyond that and almost say, how do you expect to be saved if you act like that? I'm not sure that communicates the right message. Because how we act really isn't the reason we're saved. Now you understand, I'm not justifying worldliness. Because how you act does reflect upon whether or not you have real faith. And whether or not you want to follow Him and believe in Him. But we have to get it clear in our minds that the reason we do and the reason we obey and the reason for our actions is more than just so Daddy won't whoop me. It's so Daddy won't be disappointed in me. Because I appreciate so much all that He's done for me. You see the difference? It's about His good favor. Therefore, worship becomes a demonstration of how much God is worth to us. That's worship. And I think we do that beautifully here. He grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. And that took real balance. Balance. The most radical lifestyle that you could possibly live in a world filled with radical lifestyles. Right? Think about the classic of the Odyssey written by Homer. Most of us read that in school. And Odysseus, as he's traveling, he faces an impossible challenge. Because that on one side is the Scylla, which is that terrible sea monster in the Strait of Messina. And there on the other side is the Charybdis, which is that unpassable whirlpool. So he's got a sea monster on one side and a whirlpool on the other. If he goes this way, it's destruction. If he goes this way, it's destruction. So what did he do? He passed in between. You see, we live in a world of extremes. Destructive extremes. And as God's people, we need to pass in between. Find the balance. If you're subject to an invitation this morning, if you've not yet come to this radical life of balance, if you need to be baptized into Christ, give yourself to Him. Or if you just need to say, you know what, I want to calm down a little bit. I want to stop letting gravity pull me one way or the other in any area of my life. I want to be balanced. We all struggle with it because gravity's always working against us. You need to find balance. Come this morning as we stand, as we sing.